I am Olivia Natureman, and I will be moderating our forum today from West Valley Neighborhood Alliance on Homelessness. WVNAH, as it is known, exists to increase awareness and encourage collaboration and mutual support among all local residents here in the West Valley, including businesses, community groups, and elected officials to identify effective and efficient solutions to address the needs of our unhoused neighbors, our housed neighbors, and our population here in the West Valley, and mitigate its impact on neighborhoods in the West San Fernando Valley by leveraging and synergizing resources at the county, the city, and the state level. How do we go from where we are right now, right? Which we all know this is probably the number one issue that Los Angeles is facing right now. And we are reaching out to rely heavily on the people and the policies who are going to be in place that will be instrumental in uniting and engaging all of the levels of government, from our stakeholders and their neighborhood councils throughout the West Valley, of which WVNAH is proud to represent, to all the way through our city government, all the way through the state and the federal government, to urgently solve homelessness here, because we believe that that can be achieved. That is our vision at WVNAH. And so for today, I am thrilled to welcome some powerful speakers with us today. And so we have first our honor to welcome Congressperson Ms. Karen Bass, who will be here and speaking first with us today to address her policies and what she is hoping to bring with election to the mayor in our race that we have right now here, and then followed by Dr. Sam Simbaris. And Dr. Sam Simbaris will also be speaking then on his Housing First model following Ms. Bass. And we'll be talking about solutions. He is one of the pioneers of Housing First model based on the belief that housing is a basic human right. Housing First initially operated to serve individuals experiencing chronic homelessness and who are diagnosed with severe mental health and addiction. And this program was later then expanded to serve families and youth. And he will be presenting more on his program and talking about how solutions might be implemented here in Los Angeles, and taking questions after Congressperson Bass speaks. So Congressperson Bass, we are so thrilled. I'm going to give a brief introduction. Is that all right?
Of course.
All right. And so, as I said, we are so grateful that you could take time out of your busy schedule, and with everything that we know is going on, we're so glad you're here and safe. In 1990, Congressperson Bass co-founded the Community Coalition, a community-based social justice organization focused on addiction and gang violence. She was a physician's assistant and a clinical instructor at USC's Keck School of Medicine's Physician Assistant Program. From 2005 to 2010, Ms. Bass served in the California Assembly, serving as Speaker her last 2 years, and is the first African-American woman to serve as Speaker of a state legislative chamber. Ms. Bass assumed office as California's United States Representative in January 2011, representing California's 33rd Congressional District, and as a history teacher who teaches government in 12th grade. It's very exciting to be here talking with you. After redistricting, she was elected to serve the 37th District in 2012. And in 2019, Ms. Bass became chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus. She joins WVNAH today to present her positions regarding housing insecurity and homelessness, if elected as the next mayor of Los Angeles, and give her positions, as well as to answer some pre-submitted questions that come from our stakeholders here in the West Valley, as well as from WVNAH steering committee members, who will then be reading questions from our community members and then positing a question of their own after you give your introductory statements. And so I will turn it over to you, and we are welcomed and honored to have you present some of your ideas on housing and homelessness here in the West Valley. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, all of you that are on this Zoom. And I have to say that, by the way, I have a fan going because I don't have air conditioning and it is still so hot. If it is interrupting, just tell me and I will turn it off. But I have been spending a great deal of time in the Valley these days, which is nice because I have been campaigning all over the city, and we have 57 days left, and I'm very excited to get to November 9th. Let me just tell you, as you went through the introduction, I have been in Congress for a while and was really not thinking about leaving Congress at all, but made the tough decision to not run again and to come home because I have been so deeply concerned about the mushrooming emergency that I believe that we have on our streets with so many people unhoused. I have been following this problem for a very long time, back in the early days of the Community Coalition, and even before that, when I worked at LA County's emergency room, many of my patients were homeless. And to me, I believe that this is an emergency that I believe we need to address just like a natural disaster, which means when we had the earthquake that the epicenter was in the valley in 1994, we pulled out all stops and we got the job done. We did whatever it took in order to rebuild our city, to restore those two freeways that fell, and I believe we need the same mentality toward this crisis. I absolutely believe that you get people housed immediately, number one. But almost, I don't even want to call it number two. I want to call it number 1.5. You need to address why people were unhoused to begin with. One of the things that is deeply troubling to me is that now the city is so demoralized over the fact that we text ourselves twice and we thought that was going to solve the problem, that there is the attitude that the unhoused are a monolith, most of them strung out on meth, who have no interest in recovery, and people have really soured on the idea that this problem can be solved. I do not believe that at all. I absolutely believe it can be solved, but I do believe we need to have a whole of government approach, and of course the private sector and the city, and I'm happy to go into details about what I mean specifically in the course of this conversation.
Thank you so much. And so to get to that, and thank you so much for speaking to that as a state of emergency, because at WVNAH we couldn't agree more. And we also couldn't agree more that it can be solved. That's why we're here today. And so to that end, I would like to introduce some of our steering committee members. As I mentioned, they will be first asking a question that comes from our stakeholders who have sent in these questions to us. And then our first steering committee member, Mr. Thomas Booth, who is a licensed clinical social worker who works in community mental health. He's been in active recovery for 37 years from substance use disorder and currently a board member on Reseda Neighborhood Council and is the founding member, one of them, of WVNAH. And so we're very honored to have Tom here with us today. And he's going to start with a stakeholder question as mentioned, and then follow up with one of his own. Tom.
All right, thank you so much, Olivia. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. The first question does come from a stakeholder, and the question is, Los Angeles County politicians have prioritized housing the homeless over mental health care, including drug addiction, which I consider to be a fundamental problem for a large portion of that population. What are your plans for providing effective long-term care on the street so people may develop the personal strength to climb up and stay up in their lives? That's a question from a stakeholder public member.
So did you say long-term care on the street? Is that what you meant?
That's what the community members said. That's how they stated it.
Okay, well, let me just answer about substance abuse, because I'm not sure what long-term care on the street means. But as was mentioned, in 1990, I started an organization that people are familiar with called Community Coalition, but people are not familiar with the full name of the organization. The name of the organization is Community Coalition for Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment. And that's the name of the organization, and I started it in 1990 because the problem then was crack cocaine. And we didn't even want to talk about treatment. The only thing we wanted to do was criminalize anybody that was addicted. And as a healthcare professional, I fundamentally believe that you need to have treatment. Now, again, I could talk about this subject all day, but let me just try to be quick. In the 90s, we actually had a substance abuse treatment safety net that has been shredded over the last 12 years or so, and ironically, part of the shredding of this network was an unintended consequence of the Affordable Care Act. But we used to have substance abuse programs that were based on a 12-step model, and bright policymakers decided to move from a community-based model to a medical model, and that really compromised a lot of our drug treatment programs. What I believe we need to have are residential drug treatment programs community-based, with the providers being folks in recovery. When I started Community Coalition, my entire staff were people who were in recovery, and the coalition members were the drug treatment programs in South LA. You are very fortunate in the Valley to have the Tarzana Treatment Center, which is one of the few programs that actually survived. But I'm working now on a federal level to ask Health and Human Services to reconsider some of the quote-unquote improvements they put in that I think make it very difficult to provide drug treatment services now. I don't believe that we can solve the problem of the unhoused without making drug treatment on demand available. And the idea that right now what we have, the system that we have now, the longest you can be in residential care is 30 days, and you can ask for 2 extensions. That's crazy. The programs we had before, you could be in for 12 months, and then after that, you could go into a sober living for another 12 months, giving you a long time to work on your issues. That's a short answer.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you for your answer. So question 2 is mine, and it is the 2022 LAHSA homeless count results were made available last week with a reported 1.4% reduction in LA City. However, in the West San Fernando Valley, we've seen huge increases. SPA 2, which consists of San Fernando Valley and Santa Clarita Valley, reported a 5% increase, with a 36% increase in chronic homelessness, also an increase between the 65, 69-year-old population of 263%. That's not a typo, 263% for people who are 65 to 69 and SPA 2. And West San Fernando Valley Council district members have also seen an increase. We have the 2 primary ones within the West San Fernando Valley that take up the most of the land or acreage, whatever, in the West Valley. So Council District 4 has seen a 12% increase. Council District 12 has seen an increase of 43% in the last 2 years since the first, because it's been 2 years since we've done a homeless count. And then Council District 3 has had an increase of 80%.
Whoa.
So we've seen a huge climbs in the West San Fernando Valley. So any objective person would consider these latest numbers to be a confirmation of long-term failed policies. Here's my 2-part question. What do you consider the number 1 reason for this failure? And then part 2 is, what would you specifically change and what's been done so far to better solve this issue? And thank you so much for your answer.
So, to answer it, I'm trying to figure out how to answer it quickly. I mean, I think that failed leadership, but I also think that there is a failed governance. I think that, and I don't mean to be so disparaging to say that LAHSA has failed, but the problem, one of many problems, is that the county and the city are not in sync. I know the county has responsibility for services, the city has responsibility for building, but we need to be completely in sync, which is why I said we need a whole of government approach, because we also need the federal government to waive regulations and provide resources. We were just talking about one in terms of substance abuse. The state, we know that state does have some resources, but I actually believe that we need to have a decision-making structure that empowers folks to be able to make decisions over building and providing services. So, so it's hard for me to say just what is the number 1 problem, because maybe if I said the number 1 problem would be leadership and governance, that's 2. and then in governance, it's really loaded a lot because it's the dysfunction between the city and the county. I happen to believe that we need a regional approach, because one of the things that I don't want to see happen is that the solution for homelessness is to just move people out of our sight. And one place we could move them is out of the boundaries of the city into the county, into other cities. And I think we need everybody on board to say that this is a problem that we all have to solve. There was another part to your question, and I'm sorry, I forgot what the other part was.
Yeah, so also, what is the number 1 factor
Solution?
in the solution? Yeah, the biggest biggest item in solution that you could think of.
Well, again, the biggest item, this is so complex. When I would say leadership, then again, I think the mentality is the biggest impediment. We have to view this not as a problem that we're going to address or a problem that we're going to reduce. It has to be a problem that we're going to solve, and we're going to do whatever it takes in order to solve it. That's why I talk about the mentality of an emergency. And I just don't think you say you're going to address or reduce an emergency. You say you're going to solve an emergency. Maybe it comes from my mentality of working in the emergency room. That's the way I see this. So I don't mean to be, general, but it's hard for me to say what's the number one, like there's only one thing. Is that okay? I mean, please, if you want me to be more specific, I'm happy to be. It's just
thank
hard.
you. Yeah, no, understandably, it's a huge, complex issue, but I do appreciate your answer, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. And I would like to then turn it over to Ms. Stephanie Mills, a steering committee member who joined WVNAH in September 2018 and has served on the Northridge East Neighborhood Council since January 2017, to ask our next question. And so, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. Congressperson Bass, I would like to first start out with the stakeholder submitted question. This one comes from Jody F. What are your thoughts on dismantling LAHSA? And this should tailor in directly to what you were talking about before with some of the issues.
Well, let me just tell you that, if I do have the honor and privilege of serving as mayor, on day one, I would do the state of emergency. I'd set up a war room. I would centralize and expedite building and all of those things. I do think we have to deal with the governance issue. It would not be what I would do day one, because day one, we got to get people off the street, day one. But, one of the things that I want to look at is a joint powers agreement that may be similar to a metro that forces people to work together. But I do think it should be countywide, though. I don't think that it's okay. To me, it's dysfunctional in concept to have Los Angeles City and then the county when there's 87 other cities. So I have problem with that, concept. I also have problems with the acuity model, so that, you have to be in the worst possible condition to get housing first. And I just think that there's so many, difficulties, but I do want to explore something that forces the city and the county to work together and to share resources. But I know one of the problems and pushbacks from the neighboring cities is that we're the ones with the majority of the people and they don't get the resources. So there would have to be a commitment to resources in those areas too, to prevent homelessness, because that's the other thing, is that we don't pay enough attention to preventing homelessness. That's one of the frustrations with the propositions. The propositions were not designed to prevent homelessness, and so taxpayers, and I know you hear from them all the time, and we're all taxpayers, we all voted for those propositions. People feel like they didn't get their money's worth. And they feel like they didn't get their money's worth because that for every 200 people they house, 215 moved into homelessness.
And that goes indirectly to my question that I have personally for you. Because Mayor Garcetti has tried several paths to alleviate the homelessness crisis, some have been the trials of, baseline economic income to help alleviate some of those things, other initiatives to keep people from falling into homelessness, like rental assistance, and including a new office to oversee initiatives like a bridge home and a deputy mayor specifically focused on the crisis. What do you feel has worked for us as a city, and what opportunities will you go after if you're elected mayor?
And why the heck do you think you're going to do anything different? That's the real question.
I mean, if you want to answer that one, I'm sure everyone here is asking themselves that. So view this as your opportunity to be very forthright.
I don't know whether I would say, I certainly do not think I have a magic wand. And I do not think that I can come in and say, I have all of the solutions, here they are. One of the things that I think we have to do in our city, we have to take it beyond the politicians. I mean, 15 members of the council, a mayor, and 5 supervisors are not going to solve this problem by themselves. There has got to be community-based involvement and buy-in, and that's something that we can all work on and we all have a responsibility on. I said I believe in a whole of government approach. We have to go after, and I think one of the things I bring to the table that's different than my opponent is that I do have deep relationships on every level of government. And no matter what you think of politicians, at the end of the day, they are the people that make the decisions. And so I systematically sought the endorsement of every single decision maker I could find, so that I wanted to make sure that if I was elected, that I would have the support to begin with. So involving the community in a very systematic, deliberate way. I do think we have a number of incredible organizations that know what to do and do this work day in and day out that are not able to get to scale because they don't have the resources. I do think that, we have to deal with things like basic income and all. The county, are you aware of what the county is trying in terms of its algorithm to predict people that might fall into homelessness? Is something that definitely needs to continue to be explored. But what I find overall that happens in the nonprofit arena and in government is that people come up with these experiments and these pilot programs and they pilot them. And that's kind of it. And to me, I'm done piloting. I mean, I think we should be able to tie down a few of these and bring them to scale. No pilot is ever going to work if you are not able to actually bring it to scale. So I am very interested in what the county is doing in terms of predicting homelessness. But I really do believe that the first thing is to figure out how to fuse the city and the county. That really has to be number one in order to get the function. Like, for example, when they settled the lawsuit, I know it's changed now, or maybe it hasn't, maybe they haven't announced it, but it's soon to be changed, where the city settled and the county didn't, in the Alliance lawsuit. I mean, that was just a shining example to me of the dysfunction. How can you have the Alliance sue the city and the county and one entity settle, and then settle and say, well, we're going to deal with the economically unhoused, but anybody that has these social issues or medical issues, you go to the county? I don't know how you triage like that, because you're talking about, in some instances, literally the same family.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. I did want to also credit Dr. Michael A., who had the first stakeholder question. We really appreciate everyone sending them in earlier. And we also wanted to say, I know, Ms. Bass, that you had said and mentioned your opponent. And so we did also want to put out that Mr. Caruso was invited several times to also attend today, and was not able to and didn't respond. So we're really grateful that you are here today to answer questions, because we certainly would love to know on both sides what the solutions are that are proposed. So thank you again for being here today. Following Ms. Mills, thank you. I would like to welcome Mr. Ray Cole. And Ray is the Director of Enhanced Care Management that works in LA County, providing services to the unhoused in the community. He is also the president of the Canoga Park Neighborhood Council and a founding member of WVNAH. And so Ray will be asking one question from a stakeholder and then one of his own. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you so much. And we thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. The first question comes from stakeholder Tracy H. And she says, my family lives by a cul-de-sac and notices a lot of people living in their cars for extended periods of time. What are the resources you would make available to help these people and their neighbors?
Well, I think that the situation is moving people off the street right away into temporary housing, but temporary housing that's really temporary. I mean, one of the problems we have is you get somebody in quote unquote temporary housing and they never get to the next step. We have to come up with a new model of that, because to me, the days of the congregate shelters are gone. People don't want to live in their cars, but they need to be able to keep their cars. And so making sure that they have the housing that's available and the services that are available. The approach I want to use is, because we have such a difficult problem acquiring land, but the city owns a lot of land. And again, if you have a whole of government approach, you're talking about then the city may be owning about, I think it's 60 or 70 acres. But if you add all the different layers of government together, we're now talking about hundreds of acres of land. So I would start, excuse me, by building housing on publicly owned land and offering that to people who are in cars, and then providing them the services that they need to prevent them from falling back into homelessness.
Thank you so much. The second question is a question from me. How do you plan on working with homeless services organizations to provide more housing vouchers in a time where rent is way too high and people keep falling back into homelessness?
Well, you know, I'm actually trying to work with HUD now because I'm worried about some of the, what I believe are kind of crazy restrictions. You know what? I mean, I'll give you one example. Amity, you know that organization, Amity, which is really kind of like a halfway house for people coming out, men coming out of incarceration. So you go there and you can stay there for a few months and transition and you get all ready to leave. Do you know you have to go back on the street because you're no longer considered homeless so that you don't qualify for a voucher? It's those things like that that are impediments that need to happen. I mean, that need to be changed. And then the idea that you have to have an ID. Well, if you've been on the street, how do you have an ID? And I'm going to get you all ready to get an ID. Where's it going to be mailed to? I don't understand why you can't be placed in the housing, and then guess what? You'll have an address, so your ID can be mailed to it. So that all goes back to the mentality of not viewing the problem of the unhoused as a crisis, because most of the rules and regulations were put in place when it wasn't a crisis. I mean, I remember Skid Row. When I first started going to Skid Row, because I worked at County Hospital, I'd get off the freeway and drive through the row every day. And that was in the early 80s. And the demographic of the unhoused then was a 55-year-old white man who was typically an alcoholic. It was a few people. And then when crack came in, the demographics changed completely. And the population exploded. And so I think that you have to deal with what the situation is that led to the person, you know, becoming homeless today, not 30 years ago when these rules were put into place. Or the rule around mental health, frankly, was put into place 50 years ago when we decided we wanted to deinstitutionalize and made a commitment to build community-based institutions that never materialize. So we deinstitutionalized people to tents.
Thank you so much for those answers. Appreciate you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ray. All right, we have just two steering committee members who are going to ask one question each. And so I would like to welcome Ms. Pat Bates, an environmentalist and co-chair of the WVNAH Legislative Committee, and who is a member also of the Encino Neighborhood Council. So
Do you want to maybe ask both questions and then I answer them together, and then that way I wrap up in time?
Sure, of course. Our other question, and perhaps if they both want to come on and then ask them themselves, Ms. will come on, and then also Dr. Lorraine Lundquist, who is a former candidate for LA City Council, a steering board member at WVNAH, and a board member at the Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance. And
I think I've met her.
Yes, I believe you probably have. She is everywhere for sure. So if Dr. Lundquist and Ms. Bates could come on, they can ask the questions, and then Ms. Bass can answer both.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Okay, the first question is was submitted to us ahead of time. I'm going to paraphrase it just a little bit, but the neighborhood council system is overseen by Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. We have a lot of requirements. We have a lot of policies we have to comply with, and sometimes it seems like the policies do more to impede representation of our communities than support it. Many of us believe NCs should have more local jurisdiction, as they know and understand the needs of the community the best. What are your thoughts on the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, NCs in general, and are you open to allowing NCs to have a little more local control on the issue of housing and homelessness, and frankly, everything else? And the second question probably is an easy one. How do we save the remaining board and care homes and add more?
That's not
Thank
easy.
you.
Do you want me to ask my question also and then answer? Okay. So this was a question submitted by community member Shelley B. She wants to know, what changes will you make to current policies around the removal of mature trees and native habitat to make affordable housing, and where would you consider building?
Ooh, removal of mature trees and what? And native habitat?
Yes.
Oh, my. Well, let me answer that one first, because that one's, was that it? Was
Yes, that was it, from Shelley B.
Okay, and it's great to see you, Lorraine. Really appreciate you, Dr. Lindquist, for all that you do in our community. And, you know, that's an easy one because I don't think we should remove mature trees and native habitat. We need more trees. We need more new trees, young trees, but why on earth would we remove mature trees? So again, my way of doing this is looking at lands first that are publicly owned by the city. And I've looked at a lot of pictures of land that the city owns, and I haven't seen a tree on one of them. So that would be where I would start. We need more trees. We removed a lot of trees in South LA in order to move the space shuttle to the museum, and took out all of these trees. And then you put back trees, but then you wait, you know, years for them to mature. So I don't think that we should do that. And Ms. Bates, it is, I want to thank you for your leadership and your hospitality and all that you do in the Encino neighborhood and in your neighborhood council. I actually want to really evaluate Dunn and the neighborhood council system. And the way I would go about doing that is because I'm, you know, a community organizer at heart, which means I would go to the neighborhood councils. What I've found about neighborhood councils, and I know everybody that's involved in them knows this, they are drastically different from council to council, drastically different. You have some that are highly organized and functional. You have some that are completely dysfunctional and kind of are private, exclusive clubs of 6 people. And I've heard lots of, you know, issues related to Dunn. So I think that we should engage in a collective evaluation process of the entire Dunn system. And that would include looking at the distribution of resources for for neighborhood councils, as well as the power and authority, whether it's around homelessness or anything and everything else. The second question about how do we save boarding care homes, that's a much harder question. I'm very concerned about that myself. I noticed, you know, in the area where I live in LA, nearby where I live, we had a number of boarding cares that were looked like maybe before they were boarding cares, they were motels. And I noticed that they're gone now. The people are gone. The structures are still there. We desperately need boarding care homes for a lot of reasons. Boarding care homes, to me, are for a lot of people, different people, whether it's substance abuse, mental illness, medically fragile. I mean, a lot of different populations could use boarding care homes. So those are my answers to those 2 questions, and I think my time is up, and I'm extremely appreciative to you. One thing that I have learned in this campaign about the Valley is that the Valley, hands down, is the most organized part of the city. Whether you were talking about homeowners association, business association, neighborhood councils, on and on and on. And I really respect that, and I think it's going to make, if I am fortunate enough to win this election, it's going to make governing a lot easier because of the high level of organization. And in my gut, I truly believe the only way we really address our problems in LA is by bringing the city together, involving citizens in how we solve these problems, and not thinking that any one or all of the politicians together have magic wands.
And we couldn't agree more. As a Neighborhood Council Alliance, we obviously believe that that organization is powerful. And we thank you because you coming and hearing from our local stakeholders and taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule and with everything else that we know that you have going on right now. We really appreciate you taking time to honor their voices, to hear their concerns, and to address it with your plans going forward. And so we wish you good luck with your race. We thank you for your time today. And with that, we're going to let Congressperson Bass go, because I know that she has other commitments. So thank you so much for being with her, and to your staff. They were wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And by the way, if I do win this, I will not be a stranger.
Excellent. You're welcome back anytime. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And now we hope that you will all stay, because one of the questions that came up, many of them were, what are the solutions that we have going forward? Many things, as many of our steering committees members have brought up, have been tried. And as we see, the problem, as many people as get moved into housing, we have more people falling into it. And so we want to look at the situation a little bit more in depth. And with this, we are so thrilled and really appreciate Dr. Sam Simbaris, who is here today to speak to us. He is one of the founder and the original thinker of Housing First. It is essentially having a place of one's own and receiving kind of lots of house calls. Research evidence from numerous randomized control trials report housing stability rates for Housing First programs range from 80% to 90%, compared to 35% to 45% for the treatment as usual programs. Housing First has effectively ended chronic homelessness in cities and counties across the US and abroad, and is used by several organizations here in LA, including the city's Housing for Health program. Dr. Simbaris serves as CEO of the Pathways Housing First Institute and clinical associate professor, UCLA's Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. He has published widely on these topics, received recognition for his work from national and international organizations, and is here to speak on housing and homelessness solutions. So welcome to WVNAH. We are so thrilled to have you, and really truly appreciate you being flexible with your schedule today and taking extra time out of your schedule to perhaps maybe answer some questions afterwards. So we'll turn it over to you to present information first on Housing First. So welcome and thanks.
Thank you, Olivia, and good afternoon, everyone. West Valley Neighborhood Council board members, residents, and everyone else on the call. I'm honored to be invited and participate in this forum. My remarks will be a little bit about describing Housing First and also some of the lessons learned working both in LA and in other communities. And hopefully that'll serve for some framework for having a discussion about what our solutions are. I guess that the number one lesson that I've learned in working across communities is that you need a plan, and it's very useful to have a plan that is evidence informed. As Olivia said, the Housing First program is an evidence-based program, which means that there have been research trials, some 26 of them across the United States and in Canada, that all validate the data that she just presented. 80% of the time, people that receive Housing First are stably housed a year or 2 or 3 years later, compared to about 35 to 40% of people who have to do the treatment first approach. One of the issues in governance, as Congressperson Bass was saying, is that we consent Housing First approach, or are we using a treatment first approach? And previous mayors up to this point, typically in a government situation, you want to have all of your stakeholders happy. And so there's funding provided for the treatment first approach. So we still continue to have shelters and emergency housing and transitional housing, and also a program like Housing for Health, for example, which is an excellent program and based on Housing First principles, taking people that are frequent users of emergency room, providing them housing as a right, and follow-up support and treatment services. The Housing First program is widely referenced, but sometimes incorrectly understood. And fundamentally, the understanding that is missed, or the misunderstanding of Housing First, is that it's all about housing. In fact, it's actually about the service support that comes with the housing. As Congressperson Bass said, what's the first thing is housing, and 1.5, well, they're fused together. They're not like one doesn't sequence the other. housing plus support. And one thing that HUD gets wrong, and many people who say they're doing housing first get wrong, is that there's a choice about whether people have to participate in treatment or not. It's true that housing first offers housing as a basic human right, does not require treatment or sobriety as a precondition for housing. The housing is typically provided by rent subsidy pool money or any of the project-based or tenant-based, particularly vouchers. And the services can be provided by any community-based program that's effective. FSP is an excellent program if you have people with severe problems. Intensive case management is also another perfect marriage between the voucher, FSP or ICM. The program is really has been used, as an alternative to having people get clean and sober first, and it would require a community agreeing to an approach rather than trying to fund all of these approaches together. So that's number one. Can we reach a consensus about which way we're going to go in LA? Are we going to go treatment first, or are we going to try and keep everything going together? The other thing that is second lesson. Housing, ending homelessness or reducing homelessness or solving the problem requires collaboration. I'll give you two examples of the kind of collaboration that have helped a great deal in other cities. Seattle, encampments all around the city, and a great deal of concern among residents about all of the encampments. Initially, Seattle was doing the thing that most cities do. They bring the police and sanitation and move the encampments. They were going nowhere with that because the encampments were being reformed somewhere else. They shifted their approach from one of enforcement to one of collaboration and engagement. So they would address one encampment at the time. They would bring together people from the nonprofit case management community. They'd bring together people from the police to help people divert arrests and take care of citations in a convenient way with open court times in order for people to not feel threatened and to be engaged and have individualized solutions out of the encampments. They required their shelter providers to offer housing to people in encampments, but not the high barrier housing where people had to show up at the shelter a particular time or be clean and sober in order to get a bed. They adopted a housing first approach, which includes harm reduction, low barrier shelters, collaboration with nonprofits and law enforcement has helped Seattle begin to reduce the number of encampments by working with each individual in the encampment rather than moving the encampments from place to place. The most effective city in addressing homelessness recently has been the city of Milwaukee. Granted, it's a smaller city, but I think it serves as an excellent example. It's about 700,000 with the metropolitan area. But they were recently cited by HUD as having the greatest outcomes in the most recent January 2022 point in time count. After 3 years of a housing first approach, Milwaukee recorded 17 individuals on the streets on that January night in 2022. They had started with several hundred. What they did in Milwaukee is they had the lead of the local government, the mayor's office and the housing authority, along with the county government. Everyone agreed that we're going to take a housing first approach. They required the outreach teams to identify people who were most vulnerable. Most of the housing first programs start this way. They identify the most vulnerable and then work up to families, youth, other populations. And if the resources are there, you could do it simultaneously. But by focusing on the most vulnerable, it shows the community that people are not sick on the street. There's a perceived difference change. The Milwaukee folks also included the police and the district attorney who worked with outreach to expunge criminal charges related to homelessness so that those criminal charges would not impede their housing applications and people could get into the voucher program. They also didn't use the VI SPDAT or other kind of mechanical quick assessment tools. They actually used clinical and administrative data, from criminal justice, from hospital, and from the homeless service system to identify the most vulnerable people. Once the momentum built, the business community and philanthropy, notably the United Way, began to contribute to the program to add resources to it. So these cities have in common the collaboration, the choice of an intervention everyone agreed with, and the collaboration of county and state. The leadership of the mayor, this is a mayor's forum, is incredibly important because it's at the local level that these kinds of programs get implemented. I don't know that taking an emergency approach is really, that's what we've been doing for 30 years. Homelessness is a structural problem. It's going to require a multi-year effort because the income inequities that lead to the kind of poverty that makes someone homeless, the racism inherent in homelessness. Congressperson Bass mentioned a change in demographics in the 80s. You know that in every state in this country, there are disproportionately higher numbers of Black and brown people in homelessness. In Milwaukee, for example, 75% of the people who are homeless are African American. Washington, D.C., 85%. This is racism. This is income inequity. These are structural issues that need to also be addressed in terms of access to housing and acquisition of housing and all the things that have gotten in the way. The mayor can guide a program approach that would build consensus among providers and work collaboratively with the other members of government in order to do this. I think there is a playbook that's pretty well established, and there are, in addition to these cities, there are counties and countries that work in Europe, Finland, Sweden, Ireland now using nationally a housing first approach to address these issues and showing consistently good results. So that's those are my comments, and I'd be happy to answer questions or if you have them. Thank you. Thanks again for inviting me to present these ideas to you.
No, thank you very much for speaking and presenting so clearly and outlining real life solutions. And so we do have some questions from our members and things that are working in other cities. I'm from Wisconsin, so I really appreciate the shout out to Milwaukee. It truly has significant challenges there, and that this is working there is really heartening. I know we're a much bigger city, but if it's working in a city like that, it can be scaled up. And so we have some questions from our stakeholders. If you are interested and you are here and haven't yet put a question into the chat feature, it's at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. You are welcome to submit one there. We won't be going through raised hands. We'll be going through questions submitted there. And so if you could type your question in, that would be fantastic. And so the first question that we have comes from Carol Hart. Carol says, I've seen the homelessness happens to people for many different reasons, some economic and job related, others are somewhat unique. I've attempted to help an aging but working veteran to avoid foreclosure. Shockingly, we weren't successful in helping the vet and his disabled wife. Wells Fargo took their home. They're among those unfortunate people forced to live out of an RV, no doubt without sufficient resources to maintain their vehicle or pay for an appropriate and safe RV park. I later learned that an alarming number of homeless individuals are older women, divorcees, and widows who suddenly lack the resources or rights to benefits upon which they may have depended for many, many years. Many have substance abuse or mental health issues, but anyone experiencing such tragedy could easily lose their way. I'd like to know if there's a plan to address the varied needs to be found, depending on the reasons why people are experiencing homelessness by outreach personnel, and how would Housing First then differentiate between the reasons behind why people are unhoused?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to say the one thing that what you're describing in types of problems, what that highlights to me is we don't have really a social service safety net in this country. So there's very few places to turn to. If your home is being foreclosed, access to legal aid, would be a huge help in preventing that foreclosure, for example. But legal aid is underfunded and there's waiting lists. The thing about Housing First is that we have to decide as a community, where do people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness belong, and how can we best help them? The Housing First approach is pretty much founded on the idea that housing is a basic human right, so that the provision of something like a rent subsidy would help people who qualify under the financial considerations of a housing voucher. There is advocacy now for increasing the value of that voucher. In fact, last week cut down to the housing voucher program for 1 year initially, and then hopefully it'll be the legislation for ongoing. Just went from about $10.50 for 1 bedroom to $13.50, which is a significant increase, which would help a lot more people make that voucher a lot more useful. As far as the issues that bring people homelessness, I think we would do best and where it's worked most effectively is to address economic and housing issues first. The mental health and substance use issues are definitely a handicap to people. But if you think about it for a moment, the number of people who have addiction problems with mental are many, many more than the number of people who are homeless in this country. In this country, there's about, on the one night count, we come up with about 600. But the numbers for people who struggle with addiction are in the millions. And so it is also the case for people with mental illness. So if mental illness and addiction were actually the cause of homelessness, we would have a tremendous problem in homelessness. But because the people that are struggling with those issues have resources, family support, or jobs, there are many people that are working and struggling with these issues, but effectively enough to keep the job. So really the poverty and the economics of housing are really the first order of attack. And then the issues of support and treatment can be better addressed. When someone is homeless, they're thinking survival. Where can I eat? Where is it safe to sleep? Can I park my RV or my car here? Someone mentioned earlier, there are a great number of people living in cars. Where am I safe? You are in survival mode. You're not thinking, where can I go get treatment? You're thinking, will I be okay tomorrow morning? Once you're housed, all of that anxiety about survival is calmed, and you can think about the next steps, whether it's treatment or whether it's employment or whether it's connecting with family again or other supports. So that's why the Housing First approach has been so effective, because it addresses that fundamental issue of extreme poverty and then takes you out of the survival operation into thinking about a plan for your life.
Thank you so much for that answer. I definitely have seen that. I'm a high school teacher. I have many unhoused students, and it's very hard to have them, analyze DBQ questions or write essays when they don't have a place to sleep at night and they're sleeping in their car. So that is definitely something that I have experienced and seen firsthand. I did want to elevate our other stakeholders here, Emily M. And Emily says, I'm a resident of PSH. It's my opinion that Housing First is imperative, getting people with homeless experience because PTSD is the first issue that must be addressed, that having Housing First then can get into resources after that. So can you just talk a little bit for people about PTSD who have been unhoused and how Housing First might help with that? Emily, I hope that I said that.
Yeah. If I understand the question correctly, I think what I was trying to describe maybe not so well about this idea of survival. I mean, trauma is rampant among people who are homeless. If you fall into homelessness, that's a trauma to begin with, and then what happens to you during homelessness is absolutely adding to that. And the housing first approach starts with engagement. I mean, maybe I didn't make this clear, but there's a person who is going to be part of that community treatment team that's going to help you move into housing and get services and treatment after you're housed. That person is someone who should be trauma informed, so that the engagement and understanding of trauma, and also the subsequent use of drugs, alcohol to soothe the trauma is, so the drug use is understood not as an issue of addiction, but primarily an issue of trauma. So that this kind of trauma informed approach is imbued throughout each of the steps of the program, from engagement to helping the person get housing and then get treatment for trauma. I think in there also was this question about people who have been housed in PSH, and would there be a value in having people who have had that experience also work to support people who are homeless. The idea of peer support is key. It's essential. I mean, Housing First was developed by people who were experiencing homelessness. When we meaning providers, asked them what was most important. Do you want drug treatment or mental health services? It's like, no, I just want a place to live. But that sequence was really interrupted by the inclusion of the voices of people experiencing homelessness and experiencing these other problems. That's how we got to a solution that works, because it was developed by the people who needed it.
And we thank you for your pioneering work on this. It just is really inspiring, and we're so grateful that you're able to speak to it and talk about where your research has come and how it's been applied. And so there are two last questions that we have from our stakeholders, two from an anonymous submission, and then also one from Sherry DeRohanian, and they are similar. So I'm going to read them both. I think they kind of go together. Do these other cities like Milwaukee have the same rate of new homeless people falling into homelessness? How does LA compare to those other cities in terms of percentage of unhoused people that we get and keep off the street every year? And Sherry's question kind of echoes that. It says, thank you for all the information from other states. We could scale the planned strategic efforts of other cities and tailor them to the LA area. How much weight do you place on preventing those who are on the way to becoming unhoused? And the question within it then is, for instance, what are your thoughts on the Hope of the Valley's tiny homes projects? I'm not sure if you're familiar with those or not. So it's kind of two questions in there.
Yeah. As far as the numbers go, I think, certainly LA is the epicenter in terms of having the most number of people on the street. But, what's interesting also in LA, I mentioned briefly the Housing for Health program, where they have identified people going in and out of emergency rooms in hospitals, the frequent users, and then next time the person shows up in the emergency room, they're offered a Housing First program. So that's one way of getting people out of that cycle of jail, hospital, shelter, street, and then housed and stable. There are two things about prevention. You need absolutely the support services after the person is housed so they don't fall back into homelessness. Essential. That's how we get 80%. It's the support that comes after the housing. The prevention is also essential, because all this Housing First stuff does is get people who are homeless now into housing. But the structural problems I mentioned, the income inequity, the racism in housing offers, the fact that minimum wage is so low that people cannot afford a month's rent and a month's security deposit in order to get in. Some people are working full time and living in shelters. These structural problems, which are the real societal problems, continue to produce homelessness faster than we're ending it. So we could be in the homelessness ending business forever unless we address those upstream factors that keep creating homelessness. So prevention is essential. But you have to start somewhere in the sequence, and so ending would provide some relief and demonstration that we can actually get at this problem, and then work upstream, if not sequentially, even simultaneously, in order to help people not falling into homelessness. I think the Housing for Health program is extremely effective. It's small, but it is a local demonstration of what can work in Los Angeles and has been working in Los Angeles for some time. And I think it would serve as a great kind of a core of an example that can be brought to scale, so that we can, with resources, in order to address a much greater number of people who are vulnerable, expanded to populations that are homeless, not just coming out of the emergency room, people who are vulnerable, living in encampments, in their cars, and so on. But we have models that we can grow to scale.
Thank you so much for answering that question. And our last questions for today are kind of two opposing viewpoints. So I'm going to elevate them both. And then if you could respond just holistically, how you think that Housing First kind of fits within these two different views. And so the first one comes from Ken Ross. Ken has said, no one is considering the masses. Until temporary housing is available, would you support bringing basic facilities to the present encampments? And if an encampment is, quote, not an untenable location, should it be declared a sanctuary? And the other point of view that kind of goes along with that is from Kathleen Edwards, who says, while acknowledging an 80% homeless stability with those provided perpetually tax subsidized housing, which isn't surprising, I'm curious as to the percentages, the stats of those people who have that, quote, these are her quotes, free housing, but have then gone on to become self-sufficient, working, and drug-free. It seems like Housing First might lead more people away from self-sufficiency, as it does little to provide the incentive or accountability to do so. So the question is, how does Housing First fit within those two different views? Is it a sanctuary? Does it dissuade people from self-sufficiency? And thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'll try and answer them. I think the issue of sanctuary, or what do we do with encampments, I think the Seattle example is a really useful one, that I don't know that we need to declare it a sanctuary or to spend a lot of extra effort in bringing in facilities so that they're more comfortable, but I think the safety of an encampment would be essential. And the goal is really to work very quickly with the people living in encampments to get them into housing. So if you can take some measures to, it's definitely, Ken's question is really pushing in the opposite direction of what we're doing right now, which is bringing sanitation and police and just, cleaning up the encampments, people's documents, their possessions. I don't know if you've ever seen one of these things. They're quite, talk about trauma. They come with the sanitation, they take the entire tent and the contents, including people's IDs and personal possessions. So it's the idea of a sanctuary or a protected space until some other actual solution is available. I think that fits with not traumatizing people. I don't know how it fits with Housing First, but in the sense of going from the tent right into an apartment rather than being relocated. The idea of the tax subsidies and what are we paying for and what are we getting, that's a very legitimate question. And I think that when we've looked at data on outcomes, the cost of leaving someone homeless, okay, and think about what incentives that is. But someone homeless also means they're going in and out of shelter, they're going in and out of emergency room, often getting arrested, jail stays. When you add up the taxpayer dollars required that we spend, that we're already spending on people who are homeless, it's the same as or exceeds, in every study that's been done like this, same as or exceeds what it costs to put someone in housing with support services. As far as motivation goes, it kind of goes to your view of human nature in some way. I mean, what typically actually happens is not what we fear, that people are sort of getting an easy ride and they don't want to do anything. When people are housed, there's a kind of a dignity and a community membership that kicks in. People, responding to their neighbors. People want a better life. They don't want to be endlessly having, struggles with addiction or sitting back. People want the same things we want. They want to belong. They want a relationship. They want a job. They want to have a life like the rest of us have in the community. That's the way it typically works. Unless someone is very disabled or they're struggling a lot with either addiction or mental illness, then the treatment piece is a big part of the story in Housing First for the first while. These things, we're talking about severe mental illness and addiction, they don't get solved very quickly. The homelessness solved like that, but the other issues take longer. So it's really person by person and depending on where they're starting from, but generally people are motivated to do better. And as far as cost goes, it's actually cheaper doing it in the most humane and effective way as opposed to otherwise.
We did have one follow-up question that there was from Sherry. She had asked about tiny homes. We're not sure if you're familiar with that model or not.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, I think the Section 8 voucher program, I mean, if these structures, there's a couple of things about tiny home communities. I guess this issue of community integration and where do the people who are homeless in our community belong? So if you create a little, a tiny home village, then like everyone is pointing, oh, this is where all the homeless people go. It's discriminatory, it's exclusionary, it's not exactly a community integrated model. Unless you make the community homes available for everyone in the community, then it's like mixed population living there. Then it's like, oh, people who choose to live in tiny homes. Whatever structure you use, though, it's got to qualify at least for what is defined by HUD as a Section 8 voucher. It's got to have a certain number of square feet, be self-contained, have a kitchen, a bathroom. It's like a real, little house. So those are the thoughts, about that. I know they're very popular and people are looking to do all kinds of quick fixes. I guess it's the question of what do we want as a community? What do you want as a community? And where do you think people who are homeless should be living in your community?
Thank you for taking those questions from our stakeholders. I regret that we don't have time to answer them all. I did want to give a moment if there are any steering committee members. Are there any questions or anything that you would like to ask or offer up to Dr. Sam Sambaras? I'm so sorry. Right there, I had a moment.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Dr. Sam for making the time on Sunday. Really valuable information, and it's concise and makes sense. It's logical. It's evidence-based. I mean, what more could you ask for? And we really appreciate your time and expertise today. Thank you so much. Also, I'd like to thank Olivia for, again, leading one of our wonderful forum. And there's not many people that can do that better. Olivia, we appreciate your expertise and your professionalism. So thank you so much.
Of course, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and so thank you, Dr. Sambaras, for coming today, for everything that you have to offer, for all of the stakeholders who are still with us. We have saved our chat as well as the recording of this, and this will be posted. It'll be sent out to the neighborhood councils for them to share with their members. It will also be posted on the WVNAH website. It'll be going out on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, so that, and of course, shared with Congressperson Bass so that she can also share with her constituents. And the chat has also been saved. So the questions that were put forth that perhaps there wasn't time, we'll be forwarding those as well and following up with you, because we want to honor everyone's time, but we also want to make sure that your concerns and your questions are responded to, because this is how we are all going to unify and come together. We all have very different viewpoints on how to solve homelessness, but I think we all can come together, and WVNAH firmly believes, as we've talked about, that it can be solved. This is the work that we do, and we hope that by bringing together and focusing more on those solutions than on the differences of how we get there, I think is the step forward. And so we thank everyone for being here today. I thank very much to our guests, our panelists, and to the WVNAH Steering Committee for their expertise and their time. And we hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your Sunday evening. Thank you.
Thank you.